So today we're looking at the causes and consequences of inflation. So in some cases, indeed, you can have this. What do you mean prices have gone up since I got in line? I know when I order online, groceries, for instance, they say prices are subject to change and may change by the time that they're delivered or ready for pickup. So inflation, one of the key things here is to realize that it's a persistent increase in the general level of prices. So it doesn't mean that just one thing has risen in price. You may have some items that have actually dropped in price, but overall in the aggregate, as an average, we're looking at a persistent increase. So not just a quick little blip, but it happening over time. Deflation, it's just simply the opposite. A persistent decrease in the level of prices. But if prices are still rising, but at a slower rate, so let's say they were rising initially at 5%, and then they were rising at 4%, and then 3%, prices are still increasing, but we call this disinflation. So we often mean that output and unemployment have also fallen. And the reason for that is the biggest reason for deflation is that aggregate demand shifts left, output goes down, price level goes down, so we have deflation, and if output goes down, unemployment has also fallen, or in other words, unemployment has risen. And when we refer to deflation and inflation, when we are increasing or decreasing aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, when we see it there that there's a change in the price level at the new equilibrium, that tells us whether there's been inflation or deflation. Increase in the price level, inflation; decrease in the price level, deflation. So inflation rate's down, but for this poor guy, it's not going to help him much because cool, when I get a job, I'll be able to sure to buy something because prices will be low, but right now he obviously doesn't have the money to go out on a spending spree. So the effects of inflation depend on several things. The rate at which prices are rising. So let me just sort of pause for a moment. Inflation is not inherently a bad thing. It depends on what's happening and what's causing it. A healthy economy, and if you look at the central bank website, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada, kind of a healthy inflation rate is viewed as being between roughly 2 and 3%. So don't think automatically inflation is a bad thing. So depends on the rate at which prices are rising. Are they constant? Is it predictable? Whether the rate is accelerating or not, whether the rate was expected, and how the rate compares with other countries, in particular our main trading partners. Because if our prices are climbing higher relative to the rate that other countries' prices are increasing, they may not want to buy our exports anymore. And if exports goes down, a component of aggregate demand, so AD would decrease and so on. So the cost of inflation. So what happens to purchasing power if inflation is 2% and wages have remained constant? Well, what happens is that real wages, they go down. Because let's say you were earning $14 an hour before and prices around you have gone up, you can now buy less with what you're earning. So real wages, the term real means adjusted for inflation. Your wage may have remained constant at $14 an hour, but because there was inflation of 2%, it now buys you less or takes you not as far. So what happens to savings if interest rates are 3% and inflation is 5%? Well, your savings are now worth less than before because they've been eroded away from inflation, and you've been earning 3% on your savings, but inflation is 5%, so you're actually a further 2% behind than you were before. What might commercial banks do to interest rates if inflation is high in order to keep their real interest rates on loans positive? So what they may end up doing is increasing interest rates. What might happen to international competitiveness and hence to exports if a country has a higher rate of inflation than their trading partners? So we talked about this just a slide or two before. Your exports might now go down because they're viewed as being too expensive relative to either the country producing it domestically, or maybe they'll source those products from another country. Excuse me. What might be the implication for economic growth if there's a fall in the availability of savings? So if you have a fall in savings, typically, unless you're a bank borrowing from other means, you use these savings to fund investments. So often what will happen is that the amount of investments will go down because there'll be less money to lend out to firms. And the impact of uncertainty associated with inflation on investments, businesses hate uncertainty. It's not going to make them expand. So if there's a lot of uncertainty, investments tend to decrease. And why might there be labor unrest? Well, if wages aren't keeping up with inflation, there could be protests and labor unrest. And if businesses are shrinking and laying off employees because investments are down, again, there could be labor unrest. Anticipated inflation. We have something called menu costs. So firms will need to constantly be changing their prices. So think of a restaurant. If there was inflation happening all the time, the restaurant may have to keep pulling their menu off out of circulation, reprinting it with higher prices, and hence we call it menu costs, even though we're not just dealing with restaurants, we're dealing with the economy as a whole. Cost to individuals. This is known as colloquially as shoe leather costs. So we will be less likely to hold cash because it will keep losing value. And so we call it shoe leather costs because it's like you're wearing out your shoes because you keep going to the bank to withdraw money on a regular basis. I realize that most things are done electronically now, but figuratively, think of shoes being worn out as people keep withdrawing their money. And distortions to the tax system. So let's say you had a flat tax, such as for gas, so $2 per liter or 50 cents per liter, whatever. Same thing for cigarettes or liquor. If there's been an inflation, that flat tax is now going to be worth less to the government because it's not going to take them as far in terms of being able to spend it on other goods and services because it's not rising in lockstep with the inflation rates in the economy as a whole. Unanticipated inflation. So uncertainty, and as I said, businesses hate uncertainty. So it might be more difficult to predict if investments will be profitable. And again, if there's uncertainty, often businesses will pull back. There's wage distortions. Some professions can adjust their wages more easily than others, especially if you remember our talk about CPI, if the wages were indexed to inflation. So if you had a contract that said if inflation goes up by 3%, our wages automatically go up by 3%, that only happens in some professions. So obviously this might be unfair if you're not part of those kinds of professions and you're left behind and your wages don't increase when there's inflation. Resource costs. So what would be the difference between a relative price increase and a general price increase? Well, if you had a general price increase and the costs of your inputs are going up, but then the cost of everything around you are going up. So your selling price of your good goes up, the price of everything around you is also going up. If everything is going up in lockstep of 2% or 3%, you're not particularly going to feel the effect of inflation. But if you had, let's say, one input that went up in cost, let's say it was gas or oil, and there's not inflation generally in the economy, it's going to be very difficult for you to increase your sales price to offset that increase in oil, and so that will be felt much more harshly. Redistribution of income. How would you be affected as someone who has borrowed money? So let's say for a mortgage. So if you owned, for instance, a house, but you still owe some money to the bank, known as a mortgage, if your house happened to, let's say, double in value, whatever you owe the bank is going to be a relatively smaller percentage of the value of your home now. So you're going to say, hey, that loan doesn't feel like such a big deal right now. I'm feeling pretty good. But how would you be affected as someone who has saved or loaned money? So let's say you're a pensioner and you've saved $500,000 over many years. Well, that $500,000 will be worth less and less as it gets eroded or eaten away by inflation and the prices around you having increased. So your savings don't take you as far. The higher the level of inflation, the more difficult typically it is to predict, and this will most certainly lead to higher costs. Deflation. So let's look at the opposite of inflation. Let's say we have a lack of aggregate demand. So we switch AD to AD2, and we look at the price level. So we have P1 or PE and P2. So this kind of deflation is often with aggregate demand decreasing is often the reason for deflation. And if we look at output, we're going from YE to Y2. And so is this good or bad for the economy? Typically, this is bad for the economy. So yes, we have a decrease in price. You might think, hey, great, I can buy more stuff. But we also have output went down, and so unemployment went up. And I'm going to give this an unhappy face. Now let's look at another one from the supply side of the economy, where you have increased productivity or a decrease in input costs. So we have SAS1 here. Let's shift it over to here, SAS2. We'll look at the new price level. So indeed, we've had a decrease in the price level, so we have deflation. But if we look at output, we've gone from YE to Y2. So we have output is up, unemployment is down. We have price level is down. So our exports are going to be more competitive. We're producing more stuff. This is definitely good for the economy, and I'll give it a happy face. And this is often why governments will try to increase productivity or lower input costs when they have budgets and when they're trying to influence the economy. It will often be to try and make firms more efficient and industries more efficient. So the costs of deflation, they're not always positive things. So you might think personally, hey, you know, that car I had my eye on is now cheaper, but would you spend now if you thought the prices would continue to fall? So probably chances are no. So what would happen to AD? It would decrease. What would happen to profits? It would decrease. And what would happen to a firm's ability to meet debt obligations? It would be more difficult because they have lower profits. And also, if we have AD decreasing, you know that output goes down and unemployment goes up. So that's not such a great thing for an economy. So what would happen to unemployment if aggregate demand were low? So as we said, unemployment would increase. And what would be the effect on investment if business confidence is low, and hence the impact on economic growth? So we would have investments would go down. We would have economic growth would go down. So deflation is not necessarily a particularly desirable thing. And in fact, you'll read in newspaper articles if a country is heading towards deflation or showing signs of deflation, the governments and the central bank will often react immediately and go, oh, like this is a terrible thing. We have to, at all costs, try to prevent that. Let's lower taxes. Let's do government stimulus spending. Let's not get into like a deflationary spiral with the economy like slowing down and slowing down. So such a downward spiral in which aggregate demand falls even further, because remember, people aren't going to buy now if they think prices are going to fall in the future, leading to lower prices, happened in Japan since the mid-1990s. There has been some reversal of that, but for the longest time, Japan was in quite a slump. Cost of deflation. So deflation increases the value of real debt. And why? So let's do an example again of owning a house. And let's say it was worth, let's say, $1 million. And then let's say it's now worth, let's say we've really had deflation, it's worth 500,000, but the mortgage, so the amount that you owe on the house is still, let's say, 600,000. So in this extreme example, you owe more than the house is worth. Sorry about the dog. And so if you owe more than the house is worth, you definitely have increased the value of your real debt, because in fact you could sorry. So in fact you couldn't even sell the house in order to pay off your debt. So let's look at some of the causes of inflation. So let's look at one called, you need to know this well, okay? One is called demand pull inflation. This is when AD increases. And so it's called demand pull because it's the demand side that's increasing. And so you have an increase of AD, and we've gone from PE to P2. The price level has increased, so we have inflation. So demand pull is when AD increases. So what could cause an increase in AD? You know, a lot of reasons. We could have income goes up. You could have the population, whether it's through birth or through migration or immigration, excuse me, increasing. You could have lower income tax or lower business tax, because businesses would then probably invest more, and investment is also a component of AD. Exports could go up, and I'll just put etc. Now let's look at cost push inflation. So this is going to be, and again, you need to know this term well. This is going to be when SAS decreases. So we have PE over here. We have SAS2. And the price level increases to P2. So this is when costs increase, and it's important to realize independently of aggregate demand. And I'll point out why independently of aggregate demand. But a big reason for SAS decreasing is that input costs have increased. So whether it's wages or raw materials, etc. If costs increase due to an economic boom, so we don't call this cost push inflation. So if wages are responding to an increase in AD, we would call this demand pull inflation. So if you had output and we've got price level. We're going to go back to the neoclassical example of going back to the long run equilibrium. So if we had the LAS here, so if AD were to increase from AD1 to AD2, you would go from A to B. So that's in the short run. In the long run, there's going to be a long run response where wages and input costs increase because they're seeing an increase in prices around them. There's bargaining power because you're beyond the natural rate of unemployment. And so SAS then increases as wages and input costs go up. So we come to point C. So we've gone from point A to B to C. So even though there's been an increase in wages and input costs, we do not call this cost push inflation because it is not independent of an increase in aggregate demand. It's in response to the increase in aggregate demand. So we call it demand pull inflation. If wages are increased independent of demand, such as due to the power of trade unions, then we could call it cost push inflation. So types of cost push inflation, I've already sort of alluded to them, things like increases in wages. If firms were demanding more profits and they gained more power, market power, it could be because the price of imports have gone up and imports are perhaps used as raw materials or inputs for production. And that can happen because the exchange rate changes, which we'll look at more in grade 12. It could be because commodity price changes, or it could be external shocks, such as when OPEC in the 70s increased oil prices fourfold. Could be because of taxes, could also be because of expectations. So if you expected inflation to be 5% and this was built into your wage negotiation, it would indeed trigger inflation, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because wages would go up. Excessive growth in the money supply. So if you had more money chasing the same amount of goods, you would have inflation. So inflation would go up and you would have more money chasing the same amount of goods. Can this lead to economic growth? Well, think economic growth is when there's an increase or improvement in the factors of production. And has there actually been an increase in capital, entrepreneurship, land, or labor? No. So just by printing more money does not lead to a long-term sustained economic growth because the factors of production have not increased or improved. Okay, so this is from an old IB exam, but it's a typical kind of scenario that you could see on a paper 2, which is known as the data analysis or case study, or the paper 3 qualitative. Now this will change in the new syllabus starting in September of 2020, where this could appear in a different paper than the paper 2 and 3. But the question is, look at the data for Japan, and using definitions and actual values in your answer, identify the period in time which Japan experienced inflation, disinflation, and deflation. So if we were to look at this period of time, we can see that prices are, because this is a percentage change in the consumer price, the percentage change is increasing, it's positive, so this would be inflation. If we look at this time, even though you might be tempted to say that's deflation, if I were to ask you, well, are prices still increasing from year to year? Well, the increase, the percentage change is still positive, but it's increasing at a slowing rate. So we don't have deflation, we have disinflation, where we still have inflation, but it's increasing at a lower rate. And then once you get into the negative territory, where all of the percentage change in consumer prices is negative, we have deflation. And there's no term that I'm aware of when deflation is at a slower rate. So I've never heard of deflation. We're just going to call it deflation because prices are increasing at a negative percentage each year, regardless of the rate that that's happening. So the price level is falling. Okay, thank you very much.